Hello, I'm Candace Crockett. The tools for card weaving are simple: yarn and cards. The weave structures and patterns can be complex and varied. The woven pieces can be used for belts, purses, tote bags, pillows, and wall hangings. And many bands can be sewn together to make beautiful garments. I'm going to work with you on two projects. The first project involves cotton yarn and 20 cards, and we'll make this belt. The second project will involve a completely different setup and weaving structure, and we'll work with wool yarn and weave 4 bands, which then we'll stitch together to make a bag. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to need cards. And for the particular band that we're going to weave, we're going to need 20 cards. And they should be square cards, and they should have 4 holes. And the holes should be lettered A, B, C, and D. This is going to be very important when we set up, and I'll be showing you a graph later that has these letters on the graph. What you need to know is that the letters refer to these particular card holes, and each card is lettered in the same way. I refer to the cards frequently as the front of the card or the back of the card. The one side that's actually lettered is the front of the card. Now, I think we're ready to take a look at the pattern draft, which will show you all the necessary information for preparing your warps and for setting up. Each of the numbers across the bottom represent an individual card. As you can see, 20 cards are needed for this pattern. The letters A, B, C, D on the left-hand side represent the lettered holes in the cards. Each hole in each card will have its own thread, and each of these threads is represented as a square in the pattern draft. The symbol in the square represents the color of the thread. This pattern has 3 colors. The pattern draft shows you what color thread goes through each hole. Card 5, for example, has a 0 color thread through hole A, an X color thread through hole B, and a dash color thread through hole C, and another dash colored thread through hole D. The arrows at the bottom indicate the direction the threads go through the cards. This is very important. I will explain more about it later. At the bottom of the draft, I've indicated how many threads of each color you will need and how long each of these threads should be. The 72-inch warp will result in a woven band approximately 46 inches long. If you want a longer band, increase the length. Now, what I'm going to do is set up my C-clamps 36 inches apart. So that when I bring my thread around once and around again to the beginning, I'll have a total length that's 72 inches long. The pattern draft tells us that we need 26 0 threads. In my case, they are blue threads. Now, what I'm going to do is to begin at this end, tie my strand on, and proceed to wrap a total of 26 strands. That's 1, 2, 3, and I'll keep going until I reach 26. As soon as you have your 26 0 color threads, you're ready to cut that group off. Take your scissors and remember, you cut at the end that was your starting point. I just cut here. I don't cut at the other end. and that will give me now a total length of 72 inches. Now, if I'm not going to use this warp for a while, I'll just tie a simple knot in each end to keep the warp threads together. I'll set my blue threads aside and then look again at my pattern draft, which tells me that I need 38 dash threads. In my case, these are orange threads. And then I take the orange thread, prepare 38 threads in exactly the same way as I did the other threads, and then go on to prepare 16 of the X threads. Now that your warp threads are ready, the next step is to thread the cards. We now come to the arrows that I told you about at the bottom of the pattern draft. What happens in card weaving is that a card can be threaded from either right through to the left, or the threads can go from the left-hand side through to the right-hand side. This is very important in the final pattern and in how the weaving is going to look. It's a little bit tricky at first because both directions look the same. If you make a mistake and put 2 threads through going from one direction and 2 threads through going from another direction, you'll find that your card won't turn when you go to weave. The threads will wind around each other and end up ripping the card from hole to hole before the card will ever actually turn. So you've got a choice of one way or the other. It's important to understand how the threading direction looks, and in order to indicate this to you and emphasize it, I've got a chart, and I'd like for you to look at that for just a few minutes. An arrow to the left on the diagram means that you thread the card from right to left, which is from the back of the card to the front of the card. Remember, the front is the lettered side of the card and will always face the weaver's left during weaving. An arrow to the right means you thread the card from left to right, front to back. Our pattern draft calls for half the cards, 1 through 10, to be threaded from right to left, and half the cards, 11 through 20, to be threaded from left to right. You've got your cards and you're ready to start threading. You want to first begin by numbering your cards. The best place, since it's going to be what I call the neutral position, is between the D and the A hole. Number them in pencil so you can erase and use them again later. Number them consecutively and have card number 1 on the top. Now that your cards are numbered and ready, stack them in front of you with number 1 on top and get your warp threads ready for putting through the card holes. If you put a knot at the end of your threads, undo that so that everything is clear. Now, generally speaking, with this number of cards and this kind of warp thread, you're not going to have much trouble keeping the threads from tangling. When you get into lots of cards, of course, you warp in smaller numbers. Card number 1 requires 4 X-colored threads. I pick up my group of threads and I pull those 4 from the center of the group. This keeps things from tangling. I take those threads, I hold up my first card, and I look at the pattern draft. The arrow goes to the left, so I know I'm going to bring my threads through from that direction. Since each hole is taking the same color, I don't have to pay too much attention. I take those 4 threads, even them at the end, and then do an overhand knot. This holds them together and keeps the threads from tangling. Now I'm going to take that card, put it face down on the table with the section that I pulled through about 10 inches out in front. Then I'll spread those yarns down. Card 2 takes 4 0 threads. Do the same thing as with the first card. Pull out those 4 threads. Hold the card facing your left and bring through the 4 threads from the back to the front as indicated on the pattern draft. Again, since each hole is carrying the same color, I don't have to carefully look to see what goes through each hole. And I do the same thing. I bring those 4 threads together and I knot them. And put that card face down on top of number 1 with the threads right on top. I try to keep my ends even and together, so once I get all 20 cards there, it'll be easy to bring them together and keep them in order. Now we go on to card 3. And card 3, according to the pattern draft, will take a 0 thread in hole A and a dash thread in B and C and D. So I first of all pull out 1 0 thread, and then I pull out 3 dash threads. And again, these first 10 cards are all threaded from back to the front. And I look, and the 0 thread goes through hole A. I put that thread through hole A, and then I put a dash colored thread through each of the other holes. And again, I pull them through just 10 inches, gather those ends together, knot them, and then I carefully put that card face down on number 2. It's not real important that the numbers match up or that the letters match up, but I try to do that just to make things easier later. But you do want to keep things straight, as even as possible, and do what you can to keep the threads from tangling or getting mixed up. Continue threading the cards in this way, following the pattern draft until you get to card 10. Now what I'm going to do is just to take a quick look to make sure that the cards are in numerical order, and I'm going to match up the letters and also check the threading direction. Now if I look at card 1, I can see the threads show on the top, right over here, across the A. I look through each card to make sure that that's the same. If there's a card where the holes are out of order, you can just turn that card to put it in the right position. Now that everything's checked, put the cards down, and I'm ready to thread the last 10 cards. Now I pick up card 11, and this is where the change occurs. The threads now are going to go through from the opposite direction, from the left-hand side through to the right, but still this card will go face down on the stack. Now card 11 basically carries the same threads as card 10. And so I will pull out my 3 dash colored threads and the 1 0 thread. Now, same system. I hold the card up facing to my left, except that I will now come through from the other side. And notice before, when I said on these cards, the thread was in front of the A. Now the thread will be behind the A. I'll take each of those threads through. Approximately 10 inches. Tie that. And I'll put this face down on top of card number 10. And then I'll continue through the rest of the stack, threading all of these cards just the way I did card 11. I pick up card 12, look at my pattern draft. I'm going to take 2 dash threads in holes A and B, a 0 thread in hole C, and a dash thread in hole D. So I will pull those yarns out. And continue in just the same way, holding my card up, bringing the 0 color through hole C. And again, remember, the threading direction has reversed, and it's going from front through to the back and out. After threading card 12, you might want to take a look at your cards and make sure that the threading direction is right and that you can actually see it and you're doing the right thing. If I open up the cards here and look at card 10, which was the last one in the first series, I can see how the threads cross over and come right across where A is. Now, if I shift that card over and look at card 11, I can see that the thread is underneath. That's the way it should be. Now, if I look at card 12, the thread is underneath. And that will be true all the way, also on D. So that this is just the reverse of this. So I put those cards back. Cards are still in numerical order, stacked face down, one on top of another. Now it's time to go on and continue working through the rest of the cards, paying attention to the pattern draft and taking them one at a time, threading them in the right direction, in this case from left to right, pulling the threads through and stacking every single one face down on top of the stack. Now that you've got your cards threaded, stacked up, one on top of another, you're ready for the next step. Now, for this, what you want to do is grasp the cards and just sort of pull them to straighten out the threads so that you don't have everything all tangled here. Then do what you can to even up the ends and put all those little knots together. You want to make sure you don't miss anything, but also that you keep the threads fairly straight. And you can pull a little bit on those cards to tug and straighten that out. Then holding that firmly, tie one overhand knot there. If you find that your threads are real heavy and this ends up being too bulky, you can always tie 2 knots, which then you can tie together. Okay, I've got that knot there. Everything seems solid. Now this is where the rubber band comes in. You want to right away put a rubber band around there and put that rubber band around your cards so that they're not going to fall all over. Once you've got the warp threads under tension during weaving, there's no slack there and the cards will automatically stay in position. But at this point, things can get out of order easily, and the rubber band helps to keep them together. The next step is to anchor this end to a point that's very stable. Now, you can use a refrigerator door, any sort of thing like that. What I'm going to do is use a C-clamp on the table here. Make sure it's snug so that it holds. And then you want to tie this to that anchor point. Now, if you tie this around, you waste a lot of warp thread, and you also sort of shift the threads. So if you were to undo it, you might throw your tension off. I find the best thing to do is to take another cord and make it long enough to give yourself room and to be able to double it a few times. There's nothing worse than to be all tied up and stretched out and then have this cord snap. Everything goes all over the place and it's just like an explosion. So I tie that right underneath the knot so as it's tied to the anchor point, that's going to pull against the knot. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now also, when you anchor yourself down, you're going to need to have room to spread out because you're going to be weaving at the other end of the warp. We're almost ready to start weaving. One more major thing to do. Now, in order to pull the cards down to the other end and comb the warp threads, we'll slip off the rubber band. Now at this stage, you want to make sure that your cards are facing to your left, that the front of the card, the lettered side, number 1, is on your left and facing in that direction. Now as you pull the cards, you'll find that they come up against the threads, and these knots have to be moved back. Some of them can be moved back a little ways with the cards, but generally you'll have to get in there with your fingers and shift those knots and continue working with that motion. Always keeping this under tension, so as you jiggle those cards and shift them, they get in and comb that. When you come to a place where they won't move, shove them back out of the way so you can get your fingers in there and comb those threads. The entire pattern comes from the color of the warp threads. Now as I move these cards back towards me, I've got to remember to bring my rubber band along with them. Now I continue to comb these threads with my fingers and occasionally separate some out to move the tangles along, and I move the cards right along there. Now, as I get toward the end, I have to be careful. There's a tendency to concentrate on the cards and the movement and get used to shoving them against the tangles, and then if you're not careful, it can be real easy just to pull the cards right off the end. I saw a student do that once, and she was standing there holding the cards with threads all over the place. So watch that. You want to comb the threads to the end, but not all the way to the end. And then once you're down there, pull on the threads, check to make sure that the tension is the same on all the threads, that nothing's out of order. Bring the rubber band along, put that around the cards. Remember, cards still facing to your left, and do a single overhand knot, the same kind of knot that you did down at the other end. Now everything is ready, and I'm ready to secure myself to the warp. You could also use another anchor point, say another C-clamp on a table, or perhaps tie this to the back of the chair if you didn't want yourself to be tied actually to the weaving. Before I anchor myself, I want to make sure that I've got everything I'm going to need, because once I'm tied in, it's difficult to get untied. I want to make sure I've got my pattern draft and also my weft thread. The other things I will use at one time or another, but I mainly need my weft thread and pattern draft. I'll secure the knot to my waist the same way I did the knot at the other end. Now, as I do this, I also look to make sure my cards are still facing to the left. Tie this here, pull against it, make sure it's going to hold. And now I'm ready to begin my weaving. Start first of all by just moving the cards back and forth, seeing if that's comfortable. And then before I actually start weaving, I'm going to check and make sure that they're in numerical order and that I have all of my A, D holes on the top. Now if they aren't on the top, I just turn the individual card to put them on the top. So I go along, 1, 2. During the pulling down process, they will sometimes shift. So it's very important to check and make sure that they're in order. All right. Now, before you actually start weaving, what you want to do is just try turning the cards. Remember that in card weaving, each turn is a quarter turn. So that means the holes shift one position. I'm going to begin by turning the cards 1/4 turn toward my body. Now, notice how I put my hands. I've got them on the outside. These threads will be shifting position, and I don't want anything to be in the way. So I hold my hands on the outside, spread the cards slightly, they'll turn more easily, and then I pull them towards me and push them away. Now, this should work smoothly and easily, and for some reason I've got this one card here that keeps poking out of the way. That shouldn't happen. Now, if I look at that card, I see that there's this tangle here. That immediately indicates that there's a threading problem. And if I look at the card, I see that I've got 2 threads going through one way, and I've got 2 other threads going through the other way. And what's happening is that they're binding on each other, causing that card to pop up and move itself out of the deck so that things aren't working smoothly. Now, the only thing I can do about that is to stop, untie myself here, pull those 4 threads out, and rethread the card. Now, this can sometimes be a little bit tricky because you've got to be very careful to thread the cards in the proper way. So what you do is look at the card next to it. Since I know that this card is supposed to be threaded in the exact same way as card 20. And if I look at card 20, they go through here from the front of the card through to the back of the card, from left to right, the same way as the arrow on the pattern draft. So I'm going to stop now, untie myself, set that back up, and then we'll start weaving. I've fixed my misthreaded card and everything seems to be in order. First thing I'm going to do is to begin by turning my cards towards my body continuously. And the first thing will be to work with a heavy thread which will spread the warp and stabilize the weaving. I've got holes D, A on the top. That's basically my neutral or changing position. I bring the weft thread, in this case this heavy cord, across, turn 1/4 turn toward my body, pack that thread. Now at this point, what I'm really trying to do is spread these threads. So I leave a loop on the sides. Again, toward my body, draw the cards once towards, once away, come in through the shed, close to the cards so I don't pick up wrong threads, and then pack that down and open up that shed, and then also spread the threads here. Now 4 turns is going to bring AD back to the top. And usually it takes about 4 rows to spread the weaving and to be prepared to start. Now as I turn the cards, this first section, what I'm going to do is weave 40 turns towards my body, and after every 1/4 turn I bring the weft thread through. Now turn 1 brings AD towards my body. I clear the shed, and now I'm going to start with my weft thread. Now you'll notice that the weft thread I'm using is the same color of the threads that go through the border cards. I think a good way to start card weaving is to begin by turning a series of turns in one direction. This allows you to really concentrate on the width of the weaving, the edges, and how the cards turn. Now this cord that I used at the beginning will be taken out later. It will not be part of my weaving. Depending on how the cards are threaded, the threads will angle and slant either one direction or another direction. Now as you do these first 40 turns towards your body, there are a few things you want to notice. First of all, as you bring the weft thread back and forth, you want to make sure it goes neatly around the edge of the weaving. When you turn your cards and draw them towards you, you don't use the cards to beat the thread. They would just cut into the weaving. You use either your fingers or the shuttle to pack that into place. But just the turning of the cards and the moving of them causes the weaving to push aside and makes the weft thread pull out on the edges. So as you turn the cards, pack the thread into place. Then before you bring it across, you give it one little tug to make sure that that edge is nice and neat, and then you bring it across. What you want to do is you want to keep the weaving spread out, not be crunched or bunched together, but you also want that weft thread to go around the corner neatly and tightly. Otherwise, you'll have these little ugly loops all the way along the weaving. After a few turns, your pattern will start to emerge here, and what you want to do is pay attention to what it looks like and also how it relates to the pattern draft. As I continue weaving, the pattern emerges here. and I can see certain things at this point. Now the pattern that I'm weaving should be exactly the pattern that I have drafted. And if I look here, there's a blue row, which are the zeros on the pattern draft, that comes straight across. Now as I'm looking, I'm noticing that there's something wrong here. There's this blue thread that keeps popping up here. Now if I look at this side over here, it's blue all the way across, orange, and then this blue should be the same as that over there. I've got one card where the threads are in the wrong hole. Now if I look at my cards in my pattern draft, and I look at card number 16, I should have a 0 thread, a blue thread in hole A. What I have here is a blue thread in hole D and a purple thread in hole A. Now, fortunately, I can correct this fairly easily. I can just turn this card to put the blue thread in the same position that it is on the cards on either side, right there and right there. So now I'm going to have a solid blue line along there and not that little thing popping up in the air. It will also knock the purple thread down into its proper position. So after you've woven a few rows, you want to check your pattern and check it next to the pattern draft. As I continue turning my cards towards me, every 4 rows I get the pattern draft, and it's being repeated over and over again. Now, the zeros on my pattern draft here form up into a half diamond shape and then spread out to the sides. On my weaving, the zeros are the blue threads, and you should be able to see a half diamond here that then spreads out on the sides. So that when I go to count rows and try and figure out how many rows I've woven or what's happening with the pattern draft, I can count 4 for every time that blue spreads out to the side. Now notice, as I'm weaving, I'm watching that weft thread. I continually turn the cards towards me. What I'm going to do is to weave 40 turns towards my body, and then I'm going to reverse and weave 40 turns in the other direction. I'm just finishing up the 40 turns towards the body. That 40th turn will bring AD back to the top, and I'll see my blue threads, my 0 threads, spread out on each side. Now at this point, after turning 40 turns towards the body, I've got a whole series of twists built up on the other side of my cards. Now as I reverse turning the direction of the cards to away from me, those twists will untwist. Now when I start going away, I take the cards and turn away, bring them towards, and push away. Now you'll notice at this point I bring my weft across and beat into place that it looks a little bit different. This will really show up on the next turn away from the body. You'll see that what happens there is there's a reverse. And there's a long row, and the blue, since it's a repeat of the A row of the pattern, is going to be elongated there, and your edge will be slightly different. Now I'm going to continue in this manner, turning 40 turns away from my body, which will give you a little more practice, and also will clear the twists of my warp that are in my warp threads. As this continues, you'll see that the first mirror image of the pattern, the first reversal of the pattern, will close that diamond shape. And as you continue to turn away from you, you'll get a series of half diamonds that are closed on the top. As I finish my last few rows on this series of 40 turns away from the body, I find that I'm leaning forward and it's getting uncomfortable. So I'm going to reset myself closer. Now my final turn here, the 40th turn, is going to bring up the AD holes on the top. Since I'm turning my cards away from my body, I've got all the orange threads showing at this point. In other words, as my cards turn, the threads that show in the away hole are the threads that show on the top of the weaving when I'm turning away from my body. When I turn the cards towards my body, it's going to be the threads that show in the holes that are positioned towards my body. So even though you've got two threads in each card that are on the top, it's not both threads that are showing on the surface of the weaving. So far, AD is the neutral point. I turned 40 turns towards my body. When AD came to the top, I turned 40 turns away. I've got AD at the top again. Now what I'm going to do is disengage myself here, and the easiest way is to take the scissors and just clip that thread. Now I want to release that carefully and move closer to my weaving, and I'm not going to tie this around the belt, but what I'm going to do is slide it through, bring it around, and use a tapestry needle or some kind of needle to go through, pick up both sides, and that will anchor me and give me an easy release point. So as I work every few inches or so, I can easily move closer. That makes it a lot easier on the back. Now we're going to try a little variation on that pattern. What we're going to do is see what the full sequence of the turns look like, turning 4 turns towards the body and turning 4 turns away from the body. So I've been turning away, now I'm going to turn toward. I've got holes A and D on the top, and I turn my first turn towards the body, and I bring my weft thread across. Now each time you change the turning direction on your cards, you're going to get an elongation, a reversal right there at that point. Now 4 turns towards my body will bring AD back to the top. And when AD comes to the top, I'm ready to reverse and turn the opposite direction. I'm now turning away, so that I get the pattern as drafted for my first 4 turns, and then for my second 4 turns I get the exact mirror image of the drafted pattern. And when AD gets to the top, I know that I'm ready to go the other direction. I also notice that my diamond shape has closed up there at the top. So I have a full diamond. What I'm going to get weaving this way, 4 turns towards and 4 turns away, is a series of diamonds that are linked. As I'm working here, I'm running out of the weft thread, and I'll be just about ready to start a new one. Card weaving is very dense and things packed together, and these twists really hold the yarns, the weft thread, in place, so that when you start out and when you end, or when you start a new thread, you don't have to knot them or reweave them or do anything fancy. What you do is a simple overlap. Now, I'll take my weft thread here and wind more around my shuttle. Cut that, bring it through the hole there, and then what I'll do is a simple overlap. My old thread comes out one side, I bring my new thread through from the opposite side, so that I end up with one end on one side, one end on the other, and both yarns overlapping in the same shed. Now, I will leave those ends for the time being, and when I finish my weaving, I'll just clip those flush with the weaving. Now I'm going to do a slight variation on this pattern. We'll still use AD as the neutral point or the reversal point, but what we're going to do is turn 8 turns toward the body and then 8 turns away from the body. So I begin by turning toward. This really goes very quickly, and after you've been doing it for a while, you can be very fast. At first it takes a while to get used to the weft thread, just how to pull it, how much tension to put on the cards. But after you've done it for a while, you'll find that things, oops, almost did something wrong. I want to turn 8 turns towards my body, not just 4. As I finish my 8 turns away from the body and bring my weft thread across and finish that sequence, I want to show you a different pattern variation, or a pattern variation that's possible with this. And you begin, first of all, by turning the cards 1 turn towards the body to bring DC to the top. We're going to have a different neutral point with this pattern, and we're going to turn a number of turns towards the body and then a number away. But begin by looking at the pattern and see how it emerges. So I will turn towards my body, and you see the half part, the bottom part of the diamond, opening up, and I come around to AD in the top position, and I'm going to continue turning 1 more turn toward me, which is going to bring DC to the top there and is going to bring a blue spot in the middle and orange on each side there, so that it opens up that diamond to form what I call a star. Now when I turn the other way, so I've got my neutral point DC there, I'm going to now turn away from my body and then I'll get the mirror image of that part that I just wove. Now as you continue weaving, you can literally play around with all of these different rows of the pattern, put them in different sequences to each other. You can turn your cards 2 turns towards the body, 2 turns away, a whole sequence working that way. You can also take different letters and make those reversal points. But for a while, why don't you try a sequence of different things, experiment a little bit, just see what happens. And if you run into any problems, you can always just keep turning the cards in one direction until the twists catch up with you, and then reverse and turn them the other direction. What you might want to do as you work along on your band is think about the end. You might want to repeat those first series of 40 rows towards your body and 40 rows away from your body. I've finally reached my end point here. I don't think I can possibly turn those cards one more turn and still manage to clear the shed and bring my weft thread across. The ending is very quick and simple. You first of all cut your weft thread so that you've got enough that that can become part of the fringe, and then pull the cards towards you and cut right there on the other side. And then it's just a matter of sliding off those cards, releasing yourself from the weaving, pulling that out, cutting off the other end. If you want a really long fringe, you can undo that knot, but I'm going to have a short fringe on this band. Pull out that initial starting cord here. You can cut your fringe as close to the weaving as you want, or leave it very long. You don't have to be concerned about the weft thread. It will be here on the side, just hanging down is part of the fringe. Because of the tightness and that binding quality of the twisted threads that go through the cards, the weft thread is held in firmly and securely. It may come undone for one row, but it won't for any more than that. So you don't need to do any special finishing concerning the weft thread. What you probably will want to do is to give the weaving a real good steam pressing. Notice how whenever you do a reversal that it puckers up a little bit there. When that gets steamed, the threads will be more flat, and also it will take that out and make for a nice smooth band with even transitions. Now you've finished your first card weaving, and you have a belt or a band to use in some other way, or perhaps a belt to use for your next card weaving. Now what you did with this weaving was to work from my prepared pattern, and I think at this point you should have a good sense of how that pattern relates to the weaving, how the turning of the cards works, how to pull the weft thread across. And I hope at this point you have a certain real excitement about the possibilities of doing your own designs. That's what I'd like to explore in the next segment. Now I'd like to talk briefly about pattern drafting. Begin with a grid. Put the letters A, B, C, and D down the left-hand side. The letter A should be at the top. These represent the card holes. Number across the bottom for how many cards you want to use. You can always add cards. Each square in the grid represents the point at which a warp thread will show on the surface of the completed weaving. The squares may be filled in with symbols representing a complex pattern of many colors, or simpler designs may be developed with just 2 or 3 colors. Some people find it helpful to use colored pencils or felt tip markers. It is helpful to graph the mirror image so that you have 4 turns toward the body and then 4 away. It's also helpful to graph what happens when the cards are turned all in one direction for 8 turns. This gives a strong visual image of how the pattern is going to repeat and how it's going to look. The final extension shows the pattern, the mirror image, and 2 repeats turning continuously towards the body. As you saw in the weaving you just completed, threading the cards from the right or from the left affects the design. Take a look at this chart, which has a simple 11-card pattern and the mirror image. The arrows at the bottom indicate the direction the cards are threaded, and the symbols in the squares are slanted to indicate the direction of the twist. Note that on the mirror image, even the twist direction is mirrored. This pattern, threaded as directed, will produce a diamond with smooth sides. If the threading direction is just the opposite, the diamond will have jagged edges. To help you understand how the threading direction works, I've taken that pattern draft you just saw, threaded it up, and woven it in black and white yarns. If you look down here at the 3 samples in front of me, all 3 of these pieces are woven from that same pattern. This first one here, notice that the full diamond shape has a nice, smooth, black edge. Now the threading direction on this band was exactly that as indicated on the pattern draft. On this next band, the threading direction was the exact opposite of what's on the pattern draft. Notice that the angle that the threads take when the cards turn is opposed to the angle of the pattern. That's what creates that jagged edge. If you look at the third band, on that band, I wove the entire band threaded from just one direction. So one side ends up being smooth and the other side ends up being broken. Color is also an important element in your pattern. To help show you that, I have here 3 bands that are all woven from the same pattern. Each band uses the same colors, but the colors are in different positions.